Hey there, Mr. Terry, your high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, it's been a while since we've done some memes. We're going to check out another compilation from Drew, and you guys have been liking this one. It's called Where Are They Moving To? Our original videos down below. Support Drew. He's a great guy. Here we go. All right, I love maps. What's this one about?
The nation of India's diaspora, or in other words, the spread of people from their original homeland. If you're watching this video, you more than likely understand English, I think. And there's a lot of people in India that also understand English. So it shouldn't come to much surprise that a lot of Indian people have moved to English-speaking countries. Interestingly enough, though, English is the second most common language in India, but it's still only 10% of the population. Most populated country on Earth, 1.4 billion. Now, one thing you'll notice when it comes to this map is a lot of it comes down to history. There's literally like a direct link. They were part of the British Empire. And a lot of places in the British Empire were made to speak English. So yeah. So seeing the nation.
Also, it's free. It's a lot easier for people from India, and it has been historically, to move between the Commonwealth. Okay, so you're a citizen there of India. It's a lot easier to move to, again, like in Australia, go to Britain, go to Canada, that kind of thing.
Of South Africa be a pretty intense color on this map is not a shocker. In fact, South Africa is in the same category as neighboring countries like Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. Of course, places right next to India are going to have a lot of people from India. Sure. Funny enough, though, that is not the case for China. The Himalayan mountains and the Tibetan plateau definitely have something to do with that. So yeah, just because a country neighbors another country doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have a lot of the people.
And it's push and pull factors. There haven't been necessarily a lot of things that have pulled Indians into China. China very self-sufficient, doesn't need foreign workforces, anything like that. By the way, South Africa, a very famous Indian, probably the most famous Indian, worked there as a lawyer, and that would be Gandhi. So that was, again, part of the British Empire at that time. Gandhi from India gets a law degree, gets his education in England, and then goes to South Africa, where he will be a defense lawyer, and then goes back to India.
India and China might be the biggest example we're going to find, though, in this video. Obviously, a lot of Indians.
By the way, India passing up China, that one-child policy where China was getting, they believe, out of hand when it came to population. So encouraging one child and kind of rewarding you for that. They've lifted that. Okay, they've lifted that for a while now, but now it's equalized them a little bit, flattened out that curve a little bit. But India still just, that's why they're passing China.
Kingdom, as well as Canada. Biggest example we're going to find, though, in this video. Obviously, a lot of Indians have moved to the United Kingdom, as well as Canada and the USA. Now, a lot of Indians don't move to Latin America, or at least the Spanish or Portuguese speaking parts, but you can find a bit more of them in Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. In fact,
yeah, indentured servitude. So there was a lot of agricultural pull there for Indians to move to, so they could be able to own their own land and that sort of thing.
Out of South Asia, that region of South America is going to have some of the most Hindus by percentage. Yep. You can also find a lot of Hindus in Australia and New
look
Zealand,
at like Guyana,
also part of the British Empire. There's Malaysia.
I think Hinduism is like the third, like number 3 religion over there, which in French Guyana, or in Guyana, one of them, Suriname, Guyana, I forget which one it is over there. But yeah, because of that. So, you know, a lot of Christians because colonized by Europeans, but then Hinduism right there. Really blow people away if you didn't know it.
Which was formerly British Malay. Now, this is something I think a little bit more recent in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. There's also Kenya and Nigeria.
Okay, in the Middle East there, if you know, like in Qatar had the World Cup, huge chunk of their labor for building all the infrastructure for the Qatar World Cup for soccer came from India. Now, famously, a lot of that led to a lot of like worker abuse. People had died. Payments not being the way that they were supposed to be was actually pretty brutal. Saudi Arabia is also under some pretty intense infrastructure buildup too and construction. So Indians serving as a big part of that.
That are outliers in Africa. Now, the UK is leading, but also there's a lot in France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. This diaspora map is one of the more interesting ones just because, like I said, India has the most population on Earth. From a country with over 1 billion population to a group with only 15 million. Quite the difference in numbers, but they both have very interesting maps. To start things off, immediately...
You know, a lot of people, I think if people don't know about Jewish population, I think this number might kind of startle people when they think about it, because they probably think that Jews make up a much higher percentage than they are, because they're a big part of history. But yeah, the number is actually small. So why is that? Well, there's a few things. First off, in Judaism, they don't actively proselyte. You're not going to see all this missionary work like you saw with early Buddhism or, of course, Christianity. So it's a lot more insular of a group that way. Okay. Now, other things, affect that too, unfortunately, with genocides and whatever. But yeah, mostly it's not been a proselytizing religion, especially for how old it is.
Only 15 million. Quite the difference in numbers, but they both have very interesting maps. To start things off, immediately Russia grabbed my attention, but then I remembered the Jewish Autonomous Oblast here next to China. Yeah. This was basically the Soviet Union's version of Israel, but it was established like a decade before. This place just comes up all the time in flag communities because of their interesting design they have. Interesting to see the notable difference between Australia and New Zealand here. There's not many Jewish Kiwis, I suppose. Now, there's many in the US, but interestingly, also in Canada and in Mexico. In fact, the recently elected new president of Mexico is not only the first woman, but the first with Jewish heritage as well. I love this map differentiates.
I really like these videos where Jew gets into that and to like teach and stuff, and the funny memes are all great and haha, but like it's a great educational tool. I love this kind of direction. Drew goes in with these. So, but yeah, recent presidential election, you have a Jewish Mexican president now.
U.S. and our U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, that's still interesting. I wouldn't think Puerto Rico would have many. Same goes for Cuba and even Guatemala. I think even more shocking than that is to see Brazil and Argentina with more Jewish heritage than Canada. There's just so much in the U.S. you would think that it would just be a hop over. Of course, there's also the elephant in the room. Germany's different now. I don't know how else.
We know.
Next up, a world map of African diaspora. We started by covering a country, then a religion. Now it's an entire continent, which, funny enough, if you add up all the people in the African continent, it still doesn't add up to as many as in India. So
there are Africans, especially Eastern Africans, that claim a descendancy of ancient Israelites. They do that. You can look them up.
At where Africans go the most, and out of the top two countries, the US isn't very surprising, but Brazil kind of is. I know there's a ton of Africans that live in Brazil, there's a ton of heritage there, but I didn't think they would be among the top two. But yeah, this place is one of the most racially diverse places in the world. Now, of course, there is an unfortunate history here. The slave trade obviously went on for a very long time. I really wish we had more data on some of these other countries just because of their proximity to the continent, and there's just a strange amount of countries on this map.
There's going to be. Former Ottoman Empire. Okay, they protected the rights of Jews as well as Christians, so you're going to see that in former Ottoman Empire.
Or they just don't have the data. Again, another stark difference between Australia and New Zealand. Also, look at the difference between India and Pakistan. That's interesting. Next, let's talk about American diaspora. Because even though in terms of history, our country hasn't been around for that long, there's still a pretty interesting map. Like I said at the very beginning, we shouldn't be surprised that neighboring countries are going to have a lot of Americans move to Canada and Mexico, especially when it comes to retiring, I heard, from Mexico. Again, glad that Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory, is not included, so a lot of Americans moved to Puerto Rico, also the Dominican Republic, also the Bahamas, which is basically a neighboring country. I'm surprised to see Cuba even in any category here. I guess that's the lowest you can go. They can't have no data. But how many Americans are moving?
Unless they're like Cuban Americans that returned to Cuba but have citizenship. Parents were born in Cuba. You were then brought over as a child, or your parents came over as a child, and you go back to Cuba. Could be possible. Get an education, whatever. Go back to Cuba, start a business.
Moving to Cuba, really? Yeah, there's definitely a lot of Americans in Costa Rica. I can attest to that. I saw a lot on my own vacation there. A good amount in Honduras, El Salvador, and Panama too, though. U.S. citizens apparently really...
Yeah, Americans love Costa Rica for great place to vacation. Again, can kind of retire there. A lot of people do that.
Like Brazil, though, when it comes to South America. I mean, Brazil is up in the same category as a place like France, which is crazy. I mean, they're destroying places like Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Chile.
Saw the Galapagos
in South Africa isn't quite that shocking. But for some of these other places, I mean, I can't even begin to explain why there are this many Americans in Libya.
These are places that have American economic interests. And that's the story between all of this with the United States. United States is a global capitalist enterprise here. So they have people everywhere because American business is everywhere. So there, you also got oil industry. It's going to be big there. Places like Saudi Arabia is going to have a ton because the United States financed the oil industry in Saudi Arabia. So
I mean, I can't even begin to explain why there are this many Americans in Libya. Like Kenya I get, and Liberia I get if you know the history of Liberia. I mean, there's a reason why their flag looks like this. I need to look this up. I wonder if some of this stuff has...
You're gonna get to it. Okay, no Liberia history, can do this super quick. So Liberia was a protectorate of the United States during the scramble of Africa, late 1800s. Now, the reason why might be seen a little nefarious. Liberia was set to be a place where freed African slaves could go to and maybe be encouraged to go to by Americans there in the 1800s. And so it was like for people that believed that slaves, freed slaves were not going to be able to assimilate into American culture. It'd be like this back to Africa movement. And it didn't really go very well. I mean, I don't know. I forget how many actually ended up going in the 1800s, maybe around like 30,000 or something like that, out of millions. I can't remember the exact number, but yeah, it didn't work that way because, I mean, if you're like a freed slave, right? Whether it was before emancipation or after the Civil War or whatever, it's like you have no connection to Africa. These people have been here for generations upon generations. I remember the import of slave trade stopped in the early 1800s. And so they didn't feel a connection there. So yeah, that's the story
of Liberia. I mean, there's a reason why their flag looks like this. I need to look this up. I wonder if some of this stuff has to do with like military bases. I know that there are a lot of Americans that live in the UK, specifically by like a US military base,
especially in Germany,
but also in France and Germany,
especially Germany, because Western Germany, propped up by the United States, Marshall Plan, part of the deal was permanent American military presence.
Especially in Bavaria, and that is because after World War II, when Germany was being occupied, the Americans were designated this region, which fun fact is a big reason why the U.S. only really know the Bavarian version of Germany and like Oktoberfest, things like that. I'm noticing
an interesting thing about that is you might have seen that connection if you are a United States soccer fan. So Jurgen Klinsmann, German coach, he coached the United States team. He really had it in well with Germany, and what they found out is there were a bunch of young men that were basically born in Germany, but their fathers were servicemen and had children with female German women. So they had that ancestry, even though they grew up in Germany, but because their father was an American citizen, they were eligible to play for the United States national team. Like Jermaine Jones, for example. So anyways, yeah, you might have saw that big influx of those German Americans.
Seen a weird theme with a lot of these
really
maps.
Helped the U.S. team.
Portugal is not getting a lot of anything. Spain will be, France will be, but the Portuguese are a strange outlier. There's a ton of Americans that are going to India. Maybe they already had family connections to India. That definitely could be the case for the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines was an American colony not that long ago. There are more Americans in China than there are in Japan. That's crazy. Same goes for...
That is kind of interesting. Japan doesn't love, immigrants. They're, it's a lot harder to get status there. It's just not what they're doing. It's not what's going on in Japan. But China, foreign business is so big.
For South Korea, even surprising amount in Turkey as well. Also,
Korea, same thing as
now with
Western
Afghanistan.
Germany, military bases,
I can only really
economic
imagine.
Support.
I'm thinking. It's got to be the military-based theory, right? Interesting. A whole 1% of U.S. population live outside of the U.S. I think that's something like 3 million people or something like that. Oh, this map has a lot more in Colombia than the other one. I've already covered a map of the Japanese diaspora. People were very fascinated by that. That was a really popular one. And a lot of people were always shocked to find out how many Japanese people live in Brazil. I should rephrase that to how many Japanese people have heritage from Japan. But what about their closest...
A lot of Chinese, too. Again, agriculture. During the Industrial Revolution, especially with China, not being an industrial nation, there was a big pull factor to do agriculture in South America or some agriculture in North America, but also, of course, like mining and railroad work. You saw that all on the western coast there.
Neighbor, the Koreans. Where exactly do Koreans move to? 7.3 million people, both descendants and early immigrants from the Korean Peninsula. Now, there is a lot in the U.S.
Korean War,
we have a lot of people with Asian ancestry here. I feel like it's pretty rare that I run into somebody from Korea. It's way more common to run into Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Vietnamese Americans. And with the Korean Peninsula's linked history to...
a couple reasons for that. First off, North Korea doesn't allow emigration, so they don't leave the country. And then South Korea is actually very stable. After the Korean War, the United States really kind of props up South Korea, builds up their economy. So not as much in the matter of push factors coming out of South Korea. Yeah, North Korea, no push.
China, it shouldn't be surprising that China has a lot, Japan has a lot too, but again, for darker reasons. Actually, there's been a lot of topics, they've talked about today. There's like
a lot
dark,
of Japanese
weird
business
things behind it. All sorts of people have been just moved forcibly. A lot of Koreans that moved to the Philippines and Vietnam, and then a lot to Australia too. Again, New Zealand, the outlier. Technically, North Korea does border Russia, so I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons why Russia is this blue. Really shocked about, though, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Now, maybe they have some sort of link to
so this could be
back
North
in the
or
Soviet
South
Union
Korea?
days. There's probably Koreans that moved to the Soviet Union or even the Russian Empire like over a century ago. And then from there, they moved to Central Asia when the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire had all this territory. That could also be the case for Ukraine as well. Look at the number of Koreans in Saudi Arabia. Now, again, that seems like maybe one more of a recent thing. See, that's the thing with like diasporas, is some of it could be from like
I don't know what's going on
centuries
there with
ago,
that.
but also it could be just someone living there right now, currently in present day. Like they just moved last week. This is insane. 84.5% of Koreans live in just 5 countries: China, the US, Japan, Canada, and then Uzbekistan. Wow. How? Uzbekistan has
I have
way
no idea
more than
what's
all the
going on with
European countries. Look at the amount of Koreans in Madagascar and Mozambique. Also, there's an equal amount of Koreans in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, or around an equal amount. Now, some of my favorite forms of these maps are just from the countries that you would probably never consider. Where exactly do people from New Zealand move to? Completely unsurprisingly, Australia is the biggest, but gotta say, Papua New Guinea is a lot more surprising. I don't think
Could be. It's like close and maybe low cost of living. That's what I would think.
Highlighted Papua New Guinea at all during this video. A lot of New Zealanders also moving to Malaysia and Thailand, maybe for retirement, or there's probably lots of reasons. Also, New Zealanders in Japan and South Korea. Again, they're going to have something somewhat similar to maybe India, I guess you could say, just the linkage to the British Empire. Big spots being Canada and the US, of course, but also a lot in Brazil. Brazil is a popular destination for like the entire world, I'm noticing. And of course, the UK, not so much Ireland. Ireland on the same boat as France, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Denmark, the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, I mean. There's not as much data here for New Zealand, but it's still pretty interesting. Look at that drop off though. 600,000 New Zealanders in Australia, then you have to go to 58,000 in the UK. That's, yeah, significantly less. Oh, there is only possibly 1,200 in Brazil. Wow. This one I just wanted to cover because I know there's probably going to be a lot of people
Bunch in, well, I guess if you want to call it a bunch, Switzerland being up there, it's kind of interesting. Oh, 4,000.
12.
Switzerland has had these periods where they will take in, especially like skilled workers. I've heard about that.
100 in Brazil. Wow. This one I just wanted to cover because I know there's probably going to be a lot of people confused. I said earlier I don't run into a lot of Koreans. I still run into Koreans, but I can honestly say I don't think I've ever met someone from Indonesia. Maybe they had like a little bit of heritage from Indonesia, but they're not like majority from.
I think you would. Like he's from California on that coast there. A lot of shipping that comes out of there, but
crazy because Indonesia is the 4th most populated country on Earth, and they're possibly projected to even pass up the US one day, being 3rd. This map shows a lot of Indonesians in the US, but
also the world's most populous Islamic country. A lot of people forget that. They get so Middle Eastern centric when it comes to thinking about Islam.
So much in Australia, weirdly. You would just think they would be. Also, New Guinea, not super big. A lot of them have moved to Malaysia. I mean, they're literally connected on, a couple islands. Okay, just Borneo, but they're basically connected here. A lot of them to just Cambodia. Wow, what is the history behind that? And it's significantly more than Thailand, Vietnam, even the Philippines. Indonesians tend to move to China over South Korea and Japan, apparently. I love that we have actual data from the North Koreans here. How did we do that? Pretty big amount in Saudi Arabia. I'm definitely noticing a theme here. Saudi Arabia pulling in a lot of people. Again, Libya. What is Libya doing? Brazil, surprisingly, I mean, we have data, but they are on the list, but it's not that much. But here's why I'm covering this. The Netherlands. Why is the Netherlands the big outlier? And what?
The Dutch ruled Indonesia for centuries. Dutch East India Company ruled that whole region for a long time. Similar to, how you're saying, how about the like India with Britain, the Dutch were doing that.
Well, that is probably due to the Dutch East Indian Company. Remember, the Netherlands were pretty big colonizers themselves, and they colonized no place bigger than Indonesia. This was their crown jewel, and they actually only gave Indonesia their independence after World War II. They also had to fight against the Japanese Empire just before that, so that was a rough decade. Surprisingly, though the Dutch and Indonesians have been linked for a couple centuries, only a couple thousands currently in Indonesia still speak Dutch. A lot of the people that moved here might have moved there a long time ago. ago. Yeah, the vast majority of Indonesians in the Netherlands, they just have Indonesian ancestry. Only a way smaller percentage are Indonesian born and then Indonesian citizens. This is a nice breakdown. There's so many other maps I can review on this topic. There's so many countries that we left out and people groups. Let me know which other ones you'd like to see in the comment section down below.
Those are big
old thanks to my patrons.
Awesome. Final thoughts. Absolutely awesome video from Drew. One of my favorites that he's done. Super informative. I learned a ton there about some of those. And I think the final takeaway you can get from this. So again, there was a lot where we're like, I don't get it. Why is it this and that? It just shows the globalized world. It's, you know, the 21st century. The economies are globalized. Everybody's interconnected. Migration and travel is as cheap and easy as it's ever been in human history. So we're just going to see more of this as time goes on and time goes on. You're going to see nationalist movements that try to, you know, prevent. There's always that going on, but like, it's just the trend that's been going on since really industrialization. So anyways, awesome video from Drew. Hopefully I was able to add a few things of my own there. Make sure you support his original video. As we end here, special thanks to the Patreon and YouTube pledgers, YouTube members. You guys got to see this video first. We'll see you next time. Bye.